One day while George Gershwin was hard at work composing the Rhapsody in Blue, his father poked his head in the room and said, "Make it good, George. It might be important." Whether or not he intentionally took the advice of his father, George Gershwin most certainly did make it good, as he did everything he wrote. And many of his compositions were not only good, but important, and lastingly popular as well. The Rhapsody in Blue, indeed, has turned out to be the music most often identified with this American genius, who became something of a legend within the years of his all-too-short life. You will notice something wonderfully vital and exciting about this music that seems to echo the pace of life in New York. It was in New York, Brooklyn to be exact, that George Gershwin was born on September 26, 1898. Strange as it may seem now, music never interested him as a youngster. As he himself said later, "I spent most of my time with the boys in the street, skating, and in general making a nuisance of myself." Then George's mother, being envious of her sister, who had just acquired a piano, decided that she wanted one for her family also. And what was more, she was determined that George's older brother, Ira, was going to take lessons. He was quieter, more studious than George, and so, of course, he was the logical one to take up music. But that didn't turn out to be the case at all. Ira wasn't interested. His talents were literary rather than musical. Later, of course, he was to become one of the theater's most brilliant lyric writers, and wrote most of the words for his brother George's melodies. It was George who became fascinated by the new piano in the front room, and just as soon as it was placed against the wall, he was at the keys. Soon, George asked to be given lessons, a pretty unusual request for a youngster. His progress was remarkable, even though some of his early teachers were perhaps less than remarkable. But at the age of 15, George came to the attention of an outstanding teacher, Charles Hambitzer, who thought very highly of his new pupil. They got along famously. In fact, Gershwin always credited Hambitzer with being the first major influence in his musical career. After a while, music became just as important in George's life as his regular school education. Upon leaving school, he easily got a job with an important music publisher, Jerome H. Remick and Company, where he used to demonstrate songs for performers interested in singing Remick publications. During this time, George had begun writing songs, which he felt were often better than the very songs he was demonstrating. But his employers kept rejecting his songs. So, in 1916, he managed to sell a song to a rival publisher, a song with a slightly cumbersome title, "When You Want 'Em, You Can't Get 'Em. When You've Got 'Em, You Don't Want 'Em." Altogether, George got exactly $5 for the song. However, he did have the satisfaction not only of seeing his first song in print at the age of 18, but knowing that it was admired by the great Sophie Tucker. George was always restless and eager to try his hand in new fields. Through his experience at Remix, he had come to know people in the theater and wanted to become involved in that exciting world. He had, in fact, already sold a song to the Schubert brothers for one of their big musical shows. He finally decided to quit the music publishing field to work as accompanist for various singers. One of his first jobs was that of rehearsal pianist for an important new musical called Miss 1917. The show had music by two giants of the musical theater, Victor Herbert and Jerome Kern. Kern, particularly, was a hero of George's, as he has been of so many other composers. Thinking back on those days, Gershwin said in later years, "Kern was the first composer who made me conscious that most popular music was of inferior quality, and that musical comedy music was made of better material. I followed Kern's work and studied each song that he composed. I paid him the tribute of frank imitation, and many things I wrote at this period sounded as though Kern had written them himself." For playing the music of Herbert and Kern as rehearsal pianist, Gershwin received $35 a week. That, of course, is ridiculously low by today's standards, but for an 18-year-old back in 1917, it wasn't too low a salary. And it did bring him to the attention of Max Dreyfus, the leading publisher of theater music who had discovered Jerome Kern. Dreyfus offered George a job as staff composer, which gave him a wonderful opportunity to compose all sorts of music for all sorts of shows. The first musical comedy with an all-Gershwin score was La La Lucille, which ran for quite a few months in 1919. And shortly afterward, Gershwin wrote Swanee, his first hit, and what a hit. It was Al Jolson who first made it popular, and of course it's been a favorite ever since. Let's listen to Swanee, as played on a piano roll by the composer himself. During the early 1920s, Gershwin wrote the songs for a very popular series of revues called George White's Scandals. One of these songs, a big production number called I'll Build a Stairway to Paradise, was a tremendous hit back in the 20s. But the song from the Scandals that has stayed popular throughout the years is Somebody Loves Me. And it was also in the early 20s that Gershwin dashed off, and we really can say dashed off, for it took him only 3 weeks, the Rhapsody in Blue, a composition for jazz band and piano which had been commissioned by Paul Whiteman. The famous conductor, up to that time, was known as perhaps the foremost dance band leader in the country, and he obviously had great faith in Gershwin's ability to do something more serious than write popular tunes. The orchestration was done by Whiteman's arranger, Ferdy Grofé, who of course has since gained great fame as the composer of the Mississippi Suite and the Grand Canyon Suite. The first performance of the Rhapsody in Blue took place at New York's Aeolian Hall, then located on West 43rd Street, on the afternoon of February 12th. In the audience were such distinguished musicians as Sergei Rachmaninoff, Fritz Kreisler, Jascha Heifetz, Leopold Stokowski, Walter Damrosch, Victor Herbert, and Leopold Godowsky. Gershwin was piano soloist, and both his performance and his new work electrified the audience, and the critics also were most impressed by this young genius of the Broadway theater who had dared to invade the concert world. Incidentally, not many people know that it was George's brother Ira who suggested the title Rhapsody in Blue. From then on, the lives of the two brothers became closely united professionally as well as personally. Although Ira had written the words for a number of George's tunes from time to time under the name of Arthur Francis, it wasn't until 1924 that they wrote their first Broadway show together. This was Lady Be Good, and in it, Fred Astaire and his sister Adele introduced this typically joyous Gershwin song, Fascinatin Rhythm. The Gershwins wrote another song for Lady Be Good, a beautiful one, in which they understandably had great confidence. But when it was actually performed on the stage, the number somehow didn't come across to the audience. The song was tried out in a couple of their later shows, but both times with no success. Finally, the song was released independently of any show and turned out to be one of the best loved of all Gershwin songs. Its title, The Man I Love. The month of December 1925 was a particularly busy one for Gershwin, with no less than 3 premieres on his schedule. The first of these was a symphonic work, which Walter Damrosch had commissioned. This was, again, to be a composition for piano and orchestra, which Gershwin at first called the New York Concerto, but then changed to the more conventional title, Concerto in F. The composer, of course, was soloist when Damrosch conducted the New York Symphony Society in its first performance, which took place at Carnegie Hall on December 3, 1925. Like the Rhapsody in Blue, the Concerto in F was well received, and by this time Gershwin had learned enough about orchestration to do the task himself. In addition to the Concerto in F, 2 Gershwin shows had their Broadway openings during December 1925, both during Christmas week. The first of these, Tiptoes, opened on the 28th and was full of high spirits, as the name of the show might indicate. Here is the composer's own arrangement and performance of one of the song hits from Tiptoes, That Certain Feeling. The other Broadway opening for Gershwin during that month was Song of the Flame, which opened just 2 days after Tiptoes. All in all, quite an active month. More shows and more song hits followed in 1926 and 1927. From OK, there was Someone to Watch Over Me and Do, Do, Do. From Funny Face, there was another all-time favorite, It's Wonderful. The great Maurice Ravel saw Funny Face and was completely delighted with the score. By this time, Gershwin had become a great favorite in various European capitals. Several of his shows were acclaimed in London, and Gershwin's songs were often being heard in Paris nightclubs. On one of his trips to Paris, in fact, George was inspired to write an orchestral description of that wonderful city. The logical title, naturally, would be An American in Paris. Walter Damrosch, who had conducted the Concerto in F, was also much impressed by this new piece and conducted the New York Symphony Society in its premiere on December 13th, 1928. Less than 2 years later, the Gershwin brothers were back in the Broadway theater with a show that had more lasting hits than any of their other shows up to that time. This was Girl Crazy, which had such all-time favorites as Embraceable You, I Got Rhythm, and But Not For Me. But George and Ira were beginning to look for something fresher than the conventional musical shows they'd been turning out year after year, and they brought to Broadway the first of 3 brilliant musicals in the satirical vein, Strike Up the Band. Then came Of Thee I Sing, which was marvelously received by critics and public. Of Thee I Sing, in fact, became not only the first musical ever to win a Pulitzer Prize, but also achieved the longest run any Gershwin show has ever had. The third of these shows, Let 'Em Eat Cake, didn't do quite as well, either critically or commercially. As far back as the middle 1920s, George Gershwin had been wanting to write an opera. In 1926, as a matter of fact, he had read Du Bois-Hayward's novel Porgy and thought it might make an ideal opera libretto. But the various and many commitments he had during those years prevented his taking time off for something that ambitious. Finally, in 1934, he started work with Hayward and with his brother Ira, who collaborated on many of the lyrics, as well as being sole author of others. Finally, Porgy and Bess had its world premiere in Boston on September 30th, 1935, and in New York 10 evenings later at the Alban Theater, where so many Gershwin shows had played. The critics, on the whole, were not overly enthusiastic, but Porgy and Bess managed to run 124 performances. Not an impressive run for a conventional Broadway musical, but most impressive for an opera. With the passing years, Porgy and Bess has grown in popularity and been produced in many parts of the world. The haunting songs, of course, seem to grow better every time we hear them.
Bess, you is my woman now. You is, and you must laugh and sing and dance for two instead of one. Want no wrinkle on your brow, no how, because the sorrow of the past is all done. Oh, best, my best, the real happiness is just begun.
Many of the top theater composers, Jerome Kern, Richard Rodgers, Irving Berlin, Vincent Youmans, and others, were lured to Hollywood from Broadway during the early 30s. The Gershwin brothers were no exception, and they wrote some wonderful songs during their stay out there. Songs like A Foggy Day, They Can't Take That Away From Me, Love Walked In, and Love Is Here to Stay. The last of these songs turned out to be the very last song George Gershwin composed. He had been complaining of severe headaches during the late spring of 1937, and on July 11th, he died following a brain operation. He had not even reached his 39th birthday. But in his short lifetime, this exciting, attractive, and amazingly gifted and prolific man had become the greatest musical idol in American history. Many warm tributes have been paid George Gershwin, but none expressed the feelings of his admirers more movingly than did the author John O'Hara, who wrote, George Gershwin died on July 11th, 1937, but I don't have to believe it if I don't want to.